infant mortality. It had shot up to over 55%, suggesting that it wasn't just her particular batch of GM soy that caused the problem, but it's generic. In fact, when they fed GM soy to mice, they looked at the testicles and they found that there was changes in the young sperm cell. They looked at the embryos when the parent mice were fed GM soy, and the embryo DNA acted differently.
Good God.
When this Russian scientist fed male rats GM soy, the testicles turned dark blue instead of pink, and the whole cell structure looked different.
I got to stop you for a minute, and we've interviewed that scientist you mentioned and many others. The point here is this stuff's been approved, humans are eating this, and lo and behold, we see fertility plummeting, we see all the same things. God, I can't believe that this is happening, and I can't believe these companies have done this.
It's remarkable. You know, when you look at their goals, Arthur Andersen Consulting worked with Monsanto early on, and they bragged in 1999 in January conference about how they worked with Monsanto executives. They asked the executives to describe their ideal future in 15 to 20 years, and the Monsanto executives described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds were genetically engineered and patented. And Andersen Consulting worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. So they have very large goals, the takeover of the food supply on Earth.
Now we do specifically, from the scientists and the studies, know what it does, because every time they change one gene to make a potato last longer or taste better or whatever the case may be, by adding insectoid genetics or mammal or other plant genetics, then it's, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, it then is a, like you say, genetic roulette, randomly thousands of things, each generation change, and can you get into that?
Sure. We'll come back to some of the other health risks about the thousands of dead animals.
Well, I mean, do that now if you want. Go ahead.
Either way. Actually, let's alter them. I think your question is excellent. The process of genetic engineering, people think it's just splicing it in precisely. What they do is they take, let's say they take a gene that produces its own pesticide out of soil bacteria. They take that gene, make millions of copies, make some changes in it, add a promoter from a virus to turn it on 24/7 around the clock, and then they put it into a gene gun. They actually shoot the gun into millions of cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of some of the cells. And then only a few of them actually get the genes, which they then grow that cell into a plant using cloning or tissue culture. Now, the process of inserting the gene and the process of cloning the cell into a plant both create massive collateral damage in the DNA. We're talking 2 to 4% difference of the DNA after it's been genetically engineered compared to before it started. So we're talking any particular mutation, any single point mutation could have deadly consequences. We're talking about hundreds or thousands of mutations. And one food plant might have 50, 60 different chimeras where they're already splicing other organisms and then splicing that and then sticking viruses on top and then firing it in randomly. Good, we're probably already doomed. Well, it turns out soon after GM soy was introduced to the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed by 50%. No follow-up studies were done. So, when you look at all of the studies together and say, well, how could a genetically engineered soybean increase allergies, it turns out there are many candidates. This process of disrupting the DNA caused an increase of a known allergen in soybeans, up to 7 times higher in cooked soy, according to Monsanto's own study. They also did a skin prick test with individuals, and at least one person had a reaction only to the genetically modified soy and not to natural soy. They then looked into the soybean and found that there was a completely new and unexpected protein, also likely from this result of massive collateral damage, and that new protein was allergenic. And then, by the way, we see studies all the time where they're growing this stuff open air, and it's now jumping into other plants. So don't get me started on that. That's the worst problem. We're taking self-generating, self-propagating genetic pollution and putting it into the environment where we have no technology to recall it. And never before vandalizing the very genetic code of the biosphere, because these are systems that never occurred over millions of years of natural development. Now it's just randomly invading. Good God. Beautifully said. And not only that, but the genes we introduce today may outlast the effects of nuclear waste. I mean, they are self-propagating possibly for the rest of our biosphere's life. And already replicating and merging and already causing, I mean, this is insane. Just to finish up with the allergies, because I know there's a lot of allergy sufferers listening, and they may want to know if these things are safe or not.
Well, that's why it's growing. No.
Yes. I talked to one allergist, by the way. He said, I used to do tests for soy allergies all the time, but now that it's genetically engineered, it's so dangerous, I tell my patients never to even try it unless it's organic and non-GMO.
God.
So there's another thing, is that the reason why 80% of all genetically engineered foods are created, and there's only 4 major crops, soy, corn, cotton, and canola, and all 4 have been engineered not to die when sprayed with the company's herbicide. So if you spray a natural soy plant with Roundup herbicide, you'll kill it. But if you spray genetically engineered Roundup-ready soy or cotton or canola or corn, then it will not die. It just all the rest of the biodiversity and weeds and plants in the fields will die. Now, that means that we pour lots more herbicide on these crops, and then when you ingest them, you ingest higher levels of this herbicide, which also might cause reaction. In addition, mice that were fed genetically engineered soy had problems with their livers, suggesting that there was a toxic insult, and their pancreas cells had changes which reduced the amount of enzymes needed to digest food.
And we now similarly see all sorts of previously rare cancers skyrocketing, juvenile onset of all these cancers, mimicking what we see in the lab animals.
And any one of which could easily be from genetically engineered foods, because it's totally a genetic roulette. One of the things is when you insert this gene cassette, which they blast into the crop, you have what's called a promoter, an on switch, which can not only just turn on this foreign gene, but it might switch on any other gene in the DNA permanently,
and that's why
it to overproduce.
And that's why it's affecting embryos in mammals.
Well, I mean, we don't actually know why it's affected. We know it has affected it, but the problem is there's not enough studies to identify the causation.
Good God, and when we get back, they're now expanding it out into every crop you can imagine. It's just, I have children, folks. You have children. We've got to stop this. Stay there. It just gets more out of control. When we get back with our guest, stay with us. We're back live, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, I should have mentioned our guest has the best-selling book worldwide on genetically engineered foods. This is stuff that I've ordered, I'm getting, and I'm going to read it all. I mean, I try to keep my children off this. I try to stay away from myself, but it's so hard. We have to. That will force the change in the industries, but they're striking back, and so our guest can tell us about that. Tell us about your best-selling book and how folks get that.
Well, Seeds of Deception is the book. It's at seedsofdeception.com. And it's sort of, I decided to weave the science of genetic engineering into the stories of how scientists were fired, stripped of responsibilities, forced out, how regulatory agencies were hijacked by the biotech industry, offered bribes, stocked with people with the biotech company's own personnel, how they rigged research, how Fox TV reporters were threatened by Monsanto's attorney, promising dire consequences to Fox and Rupert Murdoch if they ran a 5-part news series on the bovine growth hormone, how a senior professor from UC Berkeley was threatened by a Mexican official who allegedly said, "We know where your children go to school," trying to get them to not publish incriminating evidence. So I dug out the dark underbelly of GMOs and turned them into a series of stories, and then I weave the science into those stories so people can understand the risks that these foods present. Now,
GMOs are obviously the most dangerous, but just going back to with what Searle did with when they had good old Rumsfeld, who was later at Monsanto running it, and almost all, and I've read the study on air, almost all the monkeys they gave aspartame to, the baby monkeys died, and they still approved it. I mean, it's like, and so out of that culture grows this.
In fact, the aspartame is the product of genetically engineered microorganisms, so it is in the category that I report on.